When I first moved into the house, it felt like everything was falling into place. After years of living in a cramped apartment in Portland, I needed the change, space, quiet, and time to breathe. The house was just outside the city, nestled in a small, tree-lined neighborhood that felt both secluded and safe. It was the kind of house I had always dreamed of owning: large windows, hardwood floors, and a big porch where I could sit and drink coffee in the mornings. I wasn't running from anything, exactly, but after my long-term relationship ended, I craved solitude. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, to start fresh, and this house seemed like the perfect place to do it. The neighbors were friendly but distant, the kind that waved when you drove by but didn't pry. It was peaceful. Everything I wanted. For the first few weeks, life in the new house was uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, decorating, and settling into a new routine. I hung art on the walls, rearranged the furniture several times, and finally got around to setting up a few security cameras I had bought before moving in. Nothing fancy, just basic surveillance cameras I could check from my phone if I ever felt the need. But soon, little things started happening. At first, I chalked it up to living in an old house. Quirks, I called them. The way the doors seemed to creak, even when there wasn't a draft. How the floors groaned like they were settling, even in the middle of the night. The occasional flicker of the lights, which I assumed was just faulty wiring. Old houses are like that, I told myself. It's part of their charm. But then, one evening, while I was watching TV, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door closing upstairs. It was loud enough to make me pause the show, my heart skipping a beat. The door to my bedroom had slammed shut, even though I was the only one in the house. I laughed it off, telling myself it must have been the wind, even though all the windows were closed. I went upstairs, opened the door, and that was it. Nothing else happened that night, but the feeling it left me with lingered, something I couldn't quite shake. The next few days were calm again. I pushed the door incident to the back of my mind and carried on with life as usual. But soon, I began noticing more strange occurrences. Objects in my house seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I would leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them on the coffee table later. My phone charger would disappear, only to reappear in a completely different room hours later. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe I was just being forgetful. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The sounds were next. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, like a soft tapping from above. But gradually, they became more distinct. I would be sitting in the living room, reading or watching TV, and hear the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps coming from the hallway upstairs. I'd freeze, listening, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling again. But the steps were too measured, too deliberate, to be dismissed so easily. I started going upstairs to check, each time expecting to find nothing, and each time I was right. The house was always empty. It wasn't until I checked the security cameras that I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I had set them up mainly for peace of mind, not because I expected anything to happen. But when I pulled up the footage after a particularly loud night of footsteps, there was nothing. Not a single thing moved. The cameras recorded the eerie quiet of the house, the empty rooms, the stillness that didn't match what I had heard with my own ears. No doors closing, no footsteps, nothing at all. It didn't make sense. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping to catch something, anything, that would explain the noises. But the cameras showed only silence. I started to wonder if I was imagining things, but the sounds were too real. I couldn't ignore them, and now I had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was very, very wrong. The house had seemed perfect when I moved in, but now it felt different. It was like there was a presence here, something that lived in the spaces I couldn't see. It wasn't just the odd sounds or the moving objects anymore. It was the way the air felt heavier at night. like the house was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing day. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but I was unsettled. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that feeling followed me from room to room, a constant, quiet reminder that I might not be as alone in this house as I thought. The unease I felt over the next few days turned into something heavier. The odd events that I had brushed off as quirks of the house were happening more frequently now, and they were harder to ignore. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps or the occasional closing of doors. It was the feeling, the sense that something unseen was there with me, always close, always watching. It was subtle at first, like a presence at the edge of my consciousness. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing. I started to feel cold spots in the house, areas where the air was inexplicably colder, even when the rest of the room was warm. I could walk through my kitchen and suddenly the temperature would drop, goosebumps rising on my arms. The change was quick, like stepping into a shadow. It never lasted long, but it was enough to make my heart race each time. At night, the sounds grew louder. The footsteps that had once been soft taps were now distinct, like heavy boots walking slowly across the floor above me. I'd lie in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, listening to the steady creak of floorboards. They didn't come every night, but when they did, they moved through the house methodically, as if someone or something was pacing the length of the upstairs hallway. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was waiting for the next sound, for the next sign that I wasn't alone. And still, the cameras caught nothing. I had started checking the footage religiously, every night before bed, hoping for something, anything, that would explain what I was hearing. But the recordings were always the same: silence. The house, according to the cameras, was as still as a tomb. Yet I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. One night, the footsteps were so loud that I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and went upstairs, my hands shaking as I turned on the lights. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening, but everything had gone quiet. The hallway stretched out in front of me, empty and still. I checked every room, opening closets and looking under the bed like a scared child, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. When I went back downstairs, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it earlier. I always did. But now it stood slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to open it. My stomach twisted in knots. I shut the door, turning the lock again, and double-checked all the windows. They were locked. Everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been inside the house. The next day, I started doing some research. I needed to know if there was any history to this place, something that might explain the strange happenings. I spent hours online, scouring old records and forums about local legends or hauntings, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No reports of strange occurrences or past tragedies. The house was old, yes, but it didn't seem to carry any dark history with it. Still, the feeling that something was off persisted. Every day, I felt more disconnected from reality, as if the house itself was warping around me. Objects continued to move without explanation. My keys would be in one place, then appear somewhere else entirely. I would put my coffee cup down on the kitchen counter and come back minutes later to find it on the living room table. It was as if the house was playing tricks on me, testing how much I could handle before I broke. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to be growing stronger, more assertive. The small things, doors closing, footsteps, were no longer occasional occurrences. They happened daily, like clockwork, and I could feel a shift in the air. The house wasn't just haunted, it was becoming something else. Alive, almost, like it was feeding on the energy inside it. One afternoon, I came home from running errands and found all the lights in the house on. I was sure I had turned them off before leaving. My heart raced as I moved through the house, flipping switches, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. In the kitchen, the chairs had been moved away from the table, pushed to the far side of the room. In the living room, the picture frames on the walls were tilted as if someone had brushed against them. And yet, as always, the security cameras showed nothing. The worst part was that no one believed me. I had told a few friends about the strange things happening in the house, but they all gave me the same sympathetic look, like I was just stressed or imagining things. It's probably just the house settling, they'd say. Or worse, you're living alone now. It's easy to get spooked. But I knew it wasn't just me. Something was wrong with the house, and it was getting worse. The nights became unbearable. I started hearing whispers, soft at first, just below the range of hearing. But as the days passed, they became louder. It was like someone was standing just behind me, whispering my name in a voice so faint it almost blended with the sound of the wind outside. Every time I turned around, the room was empty, but the feeling of being watched never left. Then came the shadows. I began seeing them out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that seemed to move just beyond my field of vision. They would flit across the room, disappearing the moment I looked directly at them. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights. But the more I saw them, the more real they became. They were there, just beyond the edge of the light, lurking in the corners of the house, waiting for something. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew that whatever was in the house was gaining power, growing stronger with each passing day. It was no longer content to just be a presence. It wanted more. And if I didn't find a way to stop it, I feared it would soon manifest in a way that I couldn't ignore or escape. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The entity, or whatever it was becoming more than just a presence. It was pushing into my world, demanding to be acknowledged. The nights had become unbearable. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, every creak of the floorboards, and the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The day the door to the basement opened on its own was when I knew I had to do something. I had always avoided the basement. I never needed to go down there, and something about that part of the house felt wrong. But when I walked into the hallway and saw the door slowly creak open on its own, my stomach dropped. It felt like the house was beckoning me, pulling me towards something I wasn't ready to face. For a moment, I stood there frozen, my mind racing with all the things I had experienced. The footsteps, the whispers, the objects moving by themselves. The feeling of being watched had grown so intense that I felt like I was never truly alone. And now the house seemed to be revealing its secrets, calling me deeper into its darkness. I knew then that whatever was haunting me was in the basement. It had been waiting, gaining strength, feeding off my fear. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, but I couldn't run anymore. I had to face it. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone, I descended the stairs into the basement. My heart pounded in my chest, every step a struggle to move forward. The basement was dark, colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt thick with an unseen presence. I could hear my own breathing, shaky and quick, as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The room was filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. It smelled of mold and decay, and the dim beam of my flashlight did little to cut through the oppressive darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, and the silence was deafening. My breath fogged in the cold air as I scanned the room, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight tighter. I felt it before I saw it, the presence. It was stronger here, almost tangible. I could feel it pressing against me, cold and suffocating, as though the very air was alive. My stomach twisted in knots, and for a moment I thought I might turn back. But then I saw it. At the far end of the room, behind an old, rusted furnace, there was a figure. Indistinct, a shadow barely formed but undeniably there. It was as though the darkness itself had come alive, shifting and moving like smoke. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to illuminate the figure, and my heart stopped. I wasn't alone. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure was watching me, though it had no eyes. It was formless, a mass of shadow and cold, but I could feel its intent. It had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to come to it. The air around me grew colder, and suddenly the whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They echoed through the basement, disembodied voices that seemed to come from the very walls. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words, indistinct but insistent. And then one of them spoke my name. Sarah? My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as the figure shifted, moving toward me. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, creeping closer, swallowing the light. I could feel the floor vibrating beneath my feet, the walls closing in. The presence was no longer just watching. It was coming for me. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement door slammed shut just as I reached it, trapping me inside. I screamed, pounding on the door, but no one could hear me. I was alone, locked in the darkness with whatever this thing was. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my head with noise. I could feel the entity moving closer, the air around me turning colder by the second. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I could feel it, the cold pressure of something unseen brushing against my skin, a presence that wanted to reach out, to pull me into its darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself against the door, slamming my body into it until the latch gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, slamming the door behind me. My whole body was shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. But it wasn't over. Even from the other side of the door, I could feel it. The presence was still there, stronger than ever, and it wasn't going to stay in the basement for much longer. It had gained power, enough to manifest, enough to affect the physical world, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way out. I didn't stay another night in the house. I packed what I could and left, driving for hours until I reached a motel far outside of town. I didn't look back. I couldn't. That night in the motel, I watched the security footage from my phone. I had almost forgotten that the cameras were still running, still capturing every moment. My hands shook as I scrolled through the recordings, part of me hoping there would be nothing, no evidence that what I had experienced was real. But as I watched the footage from the basement, my heart sank. At first, it was just darkness, the empty basement lit only by the beam of my flashlight. But then, slowly, a shadow moved. It was barely visible at first, a flicker of movement at the edge of the frame. But as the footage continued, the shadow grew, taking form. And then I saw it. The figure. Standing in the far corner of the basement, its shape dark and formless but undeniably there. It moved toward the camera, the shadows stretching across the floor, and for a moment it almost looked human. Almost. I shut off the video, my heart racing. The entity wasn't just in the house. It had been watching me. It had been waiting for me to come to it, to face it. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know if it was tied to the house or if it was something older, something far more dangerous. But I do know one thing. It's still there. Waiting. When I moved into this house, I felt like I was finally where I needed to be. After years of bouncing from one city apartment to another, the idea of settling in a quiet town in Colorado seemed like a dream. The house was small but charming, a single-story home with big windows and a wide porch. Perfect for a fresh start. I needed the solitude, the distance. After everything that had happened in my life, I craved peace and quiet. The neighborhood seemed safe too. Quiet streets lined with tall trees, neighbors who waved but didn't ask questions. Exactly what I needed. But living alone in a place like this also brought a certain level of vulnerability. It didn't take long for the thought to creep in. What if something went wrong? What if someone tried to break in? That's when I decided to install the security system. It wasn't anything fancy, just a couple of cameras outside, one inside facing the hallway, and motion detectors on the windows and doors. I connected everything to my phone, and that simple layer of protection helped me sleep a little easier. For the first few weeks, the system was almost silent. Occasionally I'd get a notification from the app about motion outside, but it was usually nothing more than a stray cat or the wind rustling the trees. Then, one night, I got my first real alert. I was in bed, half asleep, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just another false alarm. But when I glanced at the screen, the word sent a chill through me. Motion detected at front door. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the phone and opened the app, expecting to see someone or something on the camera feed. But there was nothing. The front porch was empty. The only movement, the faint swaying of the porch light in the breeze. I sat up in bed, watching the live feed for a few more seconds, then checked the other cameras. All clear. My nerves settled slightly, but I still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I tried to convince myself it was just a glitch, maybe a gust of wind that triggered the sensor. I even told myself that the system was new and still had bugs, but deep down, I knew something felt off. I double-checked that all the doors were locked and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily after that. The next few nights passed without incident. I began to relax again, telling myself I had been paranoid. But then, it happened again. A few days later, just after midnight, I was reading on the couch when my phone buzzed with another alert. Motion detected at side door. My body tensed instantly. I checked the app, but again, the camera feed showed nothing. The side door was in view, locked and undisturbed. I stared at the screen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing. This time, the feeling of unease stuck with me longer. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. The sense of being watched, of not being alone, crept into my mind and wouldn't let go. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I woke up in the morning, something felt different. The door to the side of the house, the one from the alert, was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had locked it the night before. I always locked the doors before bed. But there it was, open just a crack, like someone had tried to come in. A cold wave of panic washed over me. I checked every room in the house, searching for signs that someone had been inside, but nothing was out of place. Everything looked as I had left it. Still, the idea that someone might have been in my home unsettled me deeply. I made sure the door was locked, this time double-checking it, and spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work. But my mind kept drifting back to that open door, to the alerts from the night before. The following nights were worse. The alerts became more frequent, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Each time, I would check the cameras and see nothing, but the signs that someone had been there were impossible to ignore. Lights that I knew I had turned off were suddenly on. The front door, which I always locked religiously, was sometimes found slightly open in the morning. And worst of all, my keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, were missing one morning, only to be found later that afternoon, sitting on the coffee table. It was as if someone, or something, was coming into my home, moving things around, watching me, and then slipping away without leaving a trace. But no matter how many times I checked the footage from the security cameras, there was never any sign of an intruder. I started to lose sleep, lying awake at night, waiting for the next alert, the next sign that something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was triggering those alerts was getting closer. And then, one night, I received an alert that sent my heart racing. Motion detected in the hallway. Inside my house. I sat up in bed, my hands shaking as I opened the app. The live feed showed nothing, just the empty hallway outside my bedroom. But I knew something was there. My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time I felt real fear. Whatever was happening, it was escalating. It was coming for me. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, my eyes locked on the hallway, listening for any sound, any indication that someone was there. My phone sat next to me on the bed, the screen still open to the live feed of the security cameras, but as always, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, but the fear gripping me was real. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I had barely moved from the bed. I hadn't been able to bring myself to leave the room, not after receiving that last alert. Motion detected in the hallway. It echoed in my mind, replaying over and over, feeding my growing paranoia. I told myself that it could have been a glitch just like the other alerts, but I knew that wasn't true. Every part of me felt it, that presence. Someone or something was in my house, getting bolder each night. Morning brought little comfort. I tried to go about my day as usual, working from home, making coffee, but I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from outside made me jump. The house, once a place of peace and comfort, now felt like a trap. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I checked the security footage again, every camera, every angle, and as always, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of an intruder. It didn't make sense. How could the system keep alerting me to motion when there was clearly no one there? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whoever or whatever was coming into my house wasn't leaving any trace. That night, I locked all the doors and windows twice. I made sure every light was off and even set up extra sensors around the house. I wasn't going to let myself be caught off guard again, but just as I lay down, already feeling the tension creeping back into my chest, the phone buzzed. Motion detected at the front door. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the phone and opened the app, expecting to see nothing again. But when the feed loaded, I saw something different. The front door was slightly open. Just a crack, but enough to make my heart race. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was coming into my house. I moved slowly, cautiously, as if whoever had opened the door could still be standing just outside, waiting. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept by my bed, and with trembling hands made my way toward the front door. My heart pounded in my chest, each step echoing in the otherwise silent house. The hallway seemed longer than ever before, and the dim light made every shadow look like it was moving. When I reached the door, I stopped. It was still open, just a few inches, but enough for me to see the darkness outside. I pressed my hand against it, gently pushing it shut, and locked it once again, double-checking the lock as my pulse thundered in my ears. Whoever, or whatever, had been there was gone now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't far. The next few nights followed the same pattern. Every night, at almost the same time, the alerts would come. Sometimes it was the front door, sometimes the side door, and more than once, it was from inside the house. Each time, I would check the cameras, check the doors, but the result was always the same: no visible intruder, but the signs that someone had been there were undeniable. Lights turned on that I knew had been off. Doors that I had locked were found open the next morning. My keys, which I had started leaving on the nightstand next to my bed, disappeared entirely one night and showed up hours later in the kitchen, as if someone had been toying with me. It was driving me mad. I called the security company, hoping for some sort of explanation, but they were as baffled as I was. The cameras were working perfectly. The sensors were fine. They couldn't explain the missing footage during the times the alerts came through, nor could they offer any solution to what was happening. By this point, I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected the phone to buzz with another alert. The anxiety was unbearable. I felt like I was being hunted, slowly, methodically, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The worst part was how close the intruder was getting. It started with the front door, then the side door, then the hallway. Each alert was bringing the presence closer to my bedroom, closer to me. I tried telling myself that it was all in my head, that there had to be a logical explanation, but I knew better. The fear gnawing at my gut told me the truth. Whoever was doing this was getting bolder. And they weren't going to stop. One night, I received the alert that nearly broke me. I had barely fallen asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I groggily reached for it, already expecting the usual, motion detected at front door. But when I read the notification, my blood ran cold. Motion detected at bedroom door. My heart felt like it had stopped. I lay there, frozen, staring at the phone in disbelief. The camera feed showed the door, slightly ajar, exactly how I had left it when I went to bed. There was no sign of movement, no shadow passing through the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was on the other side, waiting. I held my breath, listening to the silence of the room, willing myself to move, to do something. But I couldn't. Fear had gripped me entirely. The idea that someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, that they had made it this far without me noticing, was too much to bear. The phone buzzed again. Motion detected in hallway. They were inside, and they were getting closer. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, and yet I couldn't force myself to get out of bed. The phone buzzed again in my trembling hand, the glow of the screen lighting up the room just enough to show that the hallway camera was still live. But the hallway itself was empty, silent, no figure, no shadow. The tension was suffocating. I stared at the open bedroom door, waiting for something, anything, to move. My mind raced through every possibility, trying to rationalize what was happening. Could the system be malfunctioning? Was it a glitch? No, I knew better. I could feel it. Someone was there. The phone buzzed again, motion detected in the bedroom. I froze. Slowly I lifted my gaze to the screen. My breath caught in my throat. The camera feed of the hallway was still showing nothing, but now the alerts were different. They were closer, too close. My eyes darted back to the doorway. Nothing had changed. The door was still ajar, but the space beyond was filled with shadows, as if something was waiting just out of view. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. The silence pressed down on me. The darkness felt heavy, alive with the weight of whatever had been invading my home for days now. My grip tightened around the flashlight I kept beside the bed, my last defense. It felt so inadequate, a small tool against a threat I couldn't see. Suddenly the house creaked, the kind of deep, resonating sound that only happens when someone is moving. I wasn't imagining it this time. It was real, and it was right outside my door. I finally forced myself to move, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hand. I stood from the bed, every step toward the door feeling like I was walking into a nightmare. The closer I got, the louder the creaking became. I could hear it, footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stopped just a foot away from the door, my back pressed against the wall, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. But I needed to see. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I reached for the door and pulled it open. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness of the house. No sign of anyone. The only sound was the thumping of my heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that maybe the security system had malfunctioned again, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The signs had been there for days. The open doors, the missing keys, the lights flicking on by themselves, and now the footsteps, real, deliberate, and coming closer every night. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until it reached me. I didn't care if it was a ghost, a person, or something worse. I had to get out. I ran back to the bedroom and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I packed a small bag, shoving in the essentials: wallet, keys, charger. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting something to appear in the doorway at any second. But nothing came. The house remained unnervingly quiet. I left the house in a panic, barely locking the door behind me as I rushed to my car. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and my breath fogged in front of me as I fumbled with the keys. My mind raced as I replayed every strange moment, every unexplained alert, trying to make sense of it all. Who or what had been coming into my house every night? I started the car and sped out of the driveway, heading down the empty streets without looking back. I had no destination in mind, just anywhere but there. My phone buzzed again, and for a moment I considered not looking, afraid of what I might see. But I couldn't help myself. I pulled over at the side of the road and checked the app. Motion detected at front door. I watched the live feed, my heart racing, half expecting to see the front door ajar again. But what I saw instead sent a wave of ice through my veins. The door was open, but this time there was movement. A figure stepped into view, tall, indistinct, cloaked in shadow. It stood at the threshold for a moment, as if it knew I was watching. And then it stepped inside. My stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe. The figure was inside my house. It had been there all along, slipping past the cameras, triggering the sensors, but leaving no trace. I realized then that this wasn't just someone breaking into my home. This was something else entirely. Something that had been toying with me, getting closer and closer each night. It was only a matter of time before it reached me. I stared at the screen, paralyzed, watching as the figure disappeared into the darkness of the house. It was gone. But I knew it wasn't done. I didn't go back to the house that night, or any night after. I drove hours out of town, finding a motel where I could finally feel safe enough to collapse from exhaustion. I stayed up most of the night, checking the security feed from my phone, waiting for another alert, another sign that the figure was still there, still watching. But the next morning, when I checked the footage one last time, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. The figure was gone. The house was empty. Every room, every corner, nothing. No sign that anyone had ever been there. It was like the house had been purged of whatever had haunted me. But as I watched the empty halls and the stillness of the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. It hadn't finished with me yet. It was a quiet morning like any other. The kind of peaceful silence that had drawn me to this small suburban neighborhood in Seattle. After years of living in the chaos of the city, I craved this stillness. Mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch. Evenings where the only sound was the distant hum of cars on the highway. I lived alone, and that's how I liked it. The house was modest, just what I needed. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a yard surrounded by a rickety fence that needed painting. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The neighborhood was peaceful too. My closest neighbors were a retired couple down the street who kept to themselves, and the houses were spaced far enough apart that I had all the privacy I could want. It was a Wednesday when I first found the note. I had just come back from my morning walk when I noticed something on the floor near the front door. A small piece of paper folded neatly. My first thought was that it was a flyer or a misplaced delivery, maybe an advertisement for lawn services or some other mundane thing. I bent down, picked it up, and unfolded it without thinking much of it. But what I read made my breath catch in my throat. "I'm watching you." 3 simple words, written in shaky handwriting. I stared at the note, my mind racing. At first I laughed, a nervous chuckle that I tried to pass off as nonchalance. It had to be a prank. Kids, maybe, or someone with a sick sense of humor. I tossed the note into the trash, shook my head, and tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just a dumb joke. But as the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the handwriting looked, jagged, hurried. There was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself glancing out the window more often than usual, scanning the street for anything unusual. Everything seemed normal, too normal. I told myself to stop being paranoid. I was letting a silly piece of paper get under my skin. Still, I double-checked the locks before bed that night, something I hadn't done in months. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I knew that, but the feeling was there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The next few days were uneventful. The note seemed like a distant memory, and I started to feel foolish for letting it bother me. But then, little things began to happen. I started noticing a car parked across the street from my house. It wasn't unusual for cars to be there. People parked along the curb all the time. But this one was different. It was a dark sedan, older, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see who was inside. It showed up one day, and then it didn't leave. It sat there for hours. I thought maybe it belonged to someone visiting one of the neighbors, but days passed, and the car stayed parked in the exact same spot, always facing my house. At first, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a coincidence. But then one evening, as I sat by the window with a book, I looked up and saw the faint outline of a person inside the car. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. That's when the phone calls started. The first call came late at night. I was getting ready for bed when my phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence of the house. I checked the screen, but the number was unfamiliar. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" Nothing, just silence on the other end. I waited a moment, then hung up, annoyed but not alarmed. Wrong number, I thought. It happens. The second call came the next night, around the same time. Again, an unknown number. Again, silence when I answered. This time I felt a chill run down my spine. I waited for a voice, for anything, but there was only the empty hum of the line. I hung up quickly, my heart racing. It was just a coincidence, I told myself again. But deep down, I didn't believe it. By the time the third call came, I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. I answered with more urgency in my voice. "Who is this?" Silence. Then a faint click, and the call disconnected. The house felt colder after that, more isolated. The walls seemed to press in around me, the shadows longer, the silence heavier. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was impossible to shake. I checked the locks more often, peeked out the windows at the car that still hadn't moved. The street outside was quiet, but the sense of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. And then, one night, I woke up with a start. I didn't know what had woken me. There was no sound, no obvious disturbance, but something was wrong. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The house was silent, but it felt different, like I wasn't alone. I grabbed my phone, checked the time, 3:17 a.m. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to call someone. But who would I call? What would I say? I got out of bed, moving quietly, and walked to the window. The car was still there, parked in the same spot, as if it had never left. The streetlights cast long shadows across the yard, and everything looked still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Work, reading, even eating. Every time I glanced out the window, I expected to see the car still parked across the street, and every time I did, it was there, like a fixture in the background of my life now. It didn't move. I didn't see anyone come or go, but I knew someone was inside, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it, told myself that I was overreacting. People park in the street all the time, but it didn't help. Every glance out the window felt like a confirmation that something was deeply wrong. And the phone calls, they hadn't stopped. Every night, around the same time, the phone would ring. Sometimes it was early in the evening, other times it was after midnight, but always the same. Silence on the other end. The silence was worse than any voice could have been. It wasn't just empty, it felt deliberate. Whoever was calling wasn't doing it by accident. They wanted me to know they were there. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and walked outside, determined to confront whoever was in the car. My heart raced as I crossed the street, my steps heavy with the kind of dread that sits in your gut and grows with every step you take. But as I approached the car, I realized I hadn't thought this through. What was I going to do? Knock on the window and demand to know why they were watching me? What if it was nothing? What if it was something much worse? I stopped a few feet from the car, close enough to see my reflection in the tinted window. I tried to peer inside, but it was no use. The glass was too dark. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my ears as I stood there, trying to decide what to do next. Just as I raised my hand to knock on the window, the front door of the house across the street creaked open. I jumped and turned around, expecting to see someone watching me. But it was just an old man, one of my neighbors, stepping out to water his garden. He waved absent-mindedly, not even looking in my direction. I felt stupid, standing there like a fool in the middle of the street. The car hadn't moved. Nothing had happened. It was just a car. Or so I kept telling myself. I turned around and walked back to my house, my pulse still racing. As I approached the front door, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, lying on the welcome mat, was another note, folded neatly, just like the first one. I stared at it, my hands frozen at my sides. How long had it been there? Had someone left it while I was outside, distracted by the car? My mouth went dry as I bent down, picked it up, and unfolded the paper. The same handwriting greeted me, the jagged letters almost mocking in their simplicity. I told you I was watching. My hands shook as I clutched the note. I glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, someone, anyone. But the street was empty. No one was there. Just the car, parked silently across the street. I hurried inside, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. I locked every window and double-checked the back door. For the first time since moving into this house, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Not with this note and the constant feeling of being watched. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, my phone rang. I jumped, startled by the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. I fumbled with the phone, my fingers clumsy with fear. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, just like all the others. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello?" My voice was shaky, almost pleading for an answer, for something that would explain this madness. Again, silence. The same empty silence that had greeted me every time. But this time, I didn't hang up. I stood there waiting, listening to the other end of the line. There was no sound, no breathing, just nothing. But something about the silence felt different now. It felt closer. I couldn't take it anymore. "Who is this? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice breaking with a mixture of anger and fear. But the line remained silent. I was about to hang up when, just barely, I heard something. A faint click, like someone tapping their finger against the receiver. And then the call ended. I stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, searching for any explanation that made sense. Was it some kind of prank? Or was it something worse? I didn't know. All I knew was that the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was stronger now. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching me from the outside anymore. They were inside my life, invading it with every call, every note. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next phone call, the next note. My mind was running wild, imagining scenarios that only made the terror worse. The car was still there the next morning, parked in the exact same spot as if nothing had changed. But I had changed. I felt like I was losing control, like the walls of my house were closing in on me. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That a car was parked across the street? That someone had left me 2 notes? It wasn't enough. Not yet. They wouldn't take me seriously, and the last thing I needed was to seem like I was losing my grip on reality. I spent the day in a daze, too afraid to leave the house, but too paranoid to stay inside. I kept checking the windows, looking for any sign of movement outside, but everything remained still. The silence was unbearable. It was as if the whole world had shrunk down to just me, the car, and the invisible presence that seemed to be everywhere at once. That night, the phone rang again. I didn't answer it this time. I couldn't. The fear was too much. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone as it buzzed and rang, the screen lighting up the dark room with an unfamiliar number. The ringing seemed to go on forever, echoing through the house, and when it finally stopped, I felt a brief moment of relief. But it didn't last long. A second later, I heard it. A noise. Not from outside, not from the phone. From inside the house. The noise came from somewhere deep within the house. Faint at first, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. I stood frozen, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really heard it. Maybe it was the house settling, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me after days of paranoia and fear. But then it came again, clearer this time. A soft creak, like a floorboard bending under the weight of a footstep. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My body tensed, every nerve screaming at me to move, but I was paralyzed with fear. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, listening to the silence that followed the noise. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The car, the phone calls, the notes. They had all been leading to this. Someone had been watching me, tormenting me, and now they were inside the house. I grabbed the phone, my hand trembling as I dialed 911. The call barely connected before I heard another sound, closer this time. A soft, deliberate footstep, just outside my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The phone was still ringing in my ear, the distant sound of an operator's voice asking what my emergency was. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The door creaked open. I dropped the phone, the screen flashing as it hit the floor. My entire body went cold as the door swung open just enough for me to see the darkness of the hallway beyond. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with tension, like something was waiting just out of sight, ready to step into the light. And then I saw it. A shadow, shifting at the edge of the doorway. I couldn't make out its shape, but I knew someone was there. Watching me. Waiting. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the nightstand, and held it up like a weapon. My hands shook as I stepped back, my eyes never leaving the shadow in the doorway. I expected it to move, to charge at me, but it didn't. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, as if it was enjoying my fear. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. My breathing was shallow, and every muscle in my body was tense, ready to flee. But where would I go? The only way out was through the hallway, and that's where the shadow waited. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a low creak, and I watched in horror as the door began to open wider. Slowly, deliberately, it swung open, revealing the hallway beyond. But there was no one there. The shadow had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness of the house. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought it might have been my imagination, that I had scared myself into seeing something that wasn't real. But then I heard the sound again, this time unmistakable, a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, but chilling in its clarity. I'm inside. The voice came from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My eyes darted across the room, scanning every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. The room was empty. But the voice, it had been so close, as if someone had whispered it directly into my ear. My legs felt like lead as I backed away, my back pressing against the cold wall. I was shaking now, the terror consuming me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't fight something I couldn't see. I couldn't run from something that was already inside. I felt the weight of the lamp in my hand, useless against whatever this was. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to escape. My mind was racing, trying to figure out the best way to reach the front door, when I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "You can't leave." The voice was mocking, taunting me. My skin crawled with the realization that this wasn't just some intruder, it was something far worse. I didn't know how, but I knew that whoever had been watching me from the car, whoever had left the notes, wasn't outside. They had been here the entire time. Inside the house, inside the walls. The fear was overwhelming now. I felt suffocated by it, like the very air in the room was pressing down on me. Every instinct was telling me to run, to get out. But my legs wouldn't move. The house felt alive around me, as if it were part of whatever was haunting me. I could feel it watching me from every corner, every shadow, and then I saw it. A figure. Faint, barely visible in the darkness, but undeniably there. It was standing in the far corner of the room, its form indistinct, like a shadow given life. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. For what, I didn't know. I took a step back, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the lamp. The figure remained still, silent. The only sound in the room was my own ragged breathing. I wanted to scream, but the fear had stolen my voice. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. Then slowly the figure began to move. It took a single step forward, its form shifting as it came closer. My pulse raced, and I backed up until I hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. The figure took another step, and then another, each one deliberate, slow, as if it was savoring the fear radiating off of me. I raised the lamp, ready to defend myself, but I knew it was pointless. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could fight. It was something much worse. Just as the figure reached the edge of the bed, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still, and then it spoke. "I've always been here." The voice was a whisper, barely more than a breath, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. My vision blurred, my head spinning as the weight of those words sank in.